All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope that was like just slightly less time than you needed, so your energy is still all out from the conversation. So if you had some questions that came to mind that you're hoping you might find more insight into through this session, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll see if we've managed to get at those questions through the.
I've done that before.
All right. So to get us started in the discussion, we first wanted to talk about sort of the history of inclusive post-secondary and the use of the audit category and the sort of why the audit category is what has been used for enrollment of students. So when inclusive post-secondary education was started, in Alberta in the 80s and then in BC in the early 2000s. The aim was to provide students with intellectual disabilities who were excluded a meaningful post-secondary education. So people were facing extremely poor life outcomes. The opportunities for support in adulthood were largely congregated and segregated, and people were seeing good results and outcomes coming from inclusion. And so, what families wanted at that time was for life to continue and to unfold in the way that it would for young adults without disabilities through a meaningful post-secondary education. And so for families, they knew that a meaningful post-secondary education was one that was embedded in relationships so that students were part of their class, that they belonged to their campus, and that that belonging was created through the relationships that they would form. They wanted to ensure that belonging at post-secondary was not only in classes and programs of study, but that extended across the entire field of student experience into clubs, sports, recreation. And they wanted to ensure that students were seen as learners. They knew also that a meaningful post-secondary education would have to reflect the individual interests and passions of the students and what they wanted to study, that it wouldn't be up to the university or disability experts to determine which courses might be suitable or best for students. Um, and they also wanted to make sure that when they were opening space in post-secondary education, that that space would be available to any person with an intellectual disability, regardless of the level of support that they needed. And that was really important because the early architects of these efforts were involved in deinstitutionalization. And what they saw was that the planning for people to leave institutions and move into community was often organized around who was perceived to be the most able to live in community. And in a lot of cases, people with significant disabilities or who required us to get creative about how to support them would stay in institutions and never have the opportunity for inclusion in community. And so, in order to access this broad, meaningful post-secondary education, the audit category was what made it possible at the time. And it enabled access for students without prerequisites. And it also enabled modifications in the class that were individualized to each student, so that they were learning the most in their courses and were able to communicate that learning with their instructor and with peers. So we also know it's important to explain that while we're using the audit category for student enrollment, it's not the traditional audit experience that people might be familiar with in their own post-secondary education, where you just sit and observe in a class. Students are expected to participate in all aspects of class learning. They're completing exams and assignments and labs that follow the course outline and connect to the learning outcomes of the coursework. And those are modified individually for each student. So this is sort of the context for the how we got to audit category as the form of registration that's most common in inclusive post-secondary education. And also just being clear that it is distinct from traditional ways of auditing. And so we're going to move on from this, and Bing is going to talk about sort of the broader tensions of credit and education to sort of take a step back and understand broadly how credit is understood in education and connected to a meaningful education.
Hi. Yes. So my section was I was going to follow Arden, and Arden has just talked about like the history of inclusive post-secondary education in Western Canada and how it initially evolved with by granting audits for students. So what I wanted to talk about was something more from the general teaching perspective. So I've been a teacher for my whole life. I've never not been a teacher. I taught in junior high, high school, and university, and so I wanted to show a quick graphic, and then I'll um, sort of talk about that graphic. So there's a graphic which represents, to my mind, two poles. So one is they can be poles or they cannot be poles. On the one hand, we might say something is meaningful education. On the other hand, we have something that the institution, school, or university creates. Those are grades, credits, and credentials. Now, I think it's useful to pull those apart because they may be overlapping, but they may not be overlapping. So the bottom graphic represents the times that they're overlapping. So what I mean by that is that when people go to university, some people are after the meaningful experience that they get at university. That's one pole. Some people are simply after grades, credits, and credentials. It is not to say that there exists anybody who's at either extreme, but there are people at those extremes. So when we look at our students unfortunately don't have access to grades, credits, and credentials. However, if you look at our students and the experiences they have without getting grades, credits, and credentials, a lot of them have very meaningful educational experiences. Now, like Bruce used the term something like this great miserable life of ours, so some of our students won't have a great educational experience, and some of them will have a great educational experience. But interestingly, that may or may not have anything to do with the fact that they got grades, credits, and credentials. Now, I just want to stop here. I'm not trying to say that we're in the right place yet, right? I'm just trying to say that as a teacher, um, I think that what I can offer in terms of thinking this through educationally is that there are differences between grades, credits, and credentials and meaningful educational experiences. I have a friend. I don't think I ever told this story here. His name's Jim. And Jim went through university and he was studying for a degree in literature. And the last semester of his 4 years in university, he chose not to take the one class that would give him a credit to get his degree in literature. And he did it on purpose. He didn't want to have a credential. And Jim went on to have a very interesting life. Jim was working in charge of about 25 people at a printing shop, and then he retired because he was very frugal and had purchased a house at the age of about 50. And then now he owns a wine shop, which is his life's passion, a, a shop that sells like expensive wines that I could never afford. But interesting, I use Jim as just an illustration that, there's meaningful experience in education and then there's credentialing. And those two things aren't necessarily um, the same. I remember I was teaching junior high school. When I taught junior high school, one of the biggest eye openers was I used to teach vocabulary. And one day I decided I wasn't going to give any grades for vocabulary. Instead, I was just going to give out pieces of candy. And the students, they stopped getting grades for vocabulary, but they learned vocabulary a lot better than when I used to give them grades. So I think that sort of philosophically, pedagogically, like in terms of experience in education, we also have to worry about the day that we get grades, credits, and credentials. It's not going to take us out of that um, unfortunate situation that's happening more and more in universities. And that is that students, because of educational inflation, I'll say this again, because of educational inflation, because more people are getting more degrees, there's a real push towards credentialism at the expense of positive educational experience. And I see this as a professor. I see many, many students are after the grades, the credits, and the credentials, and they couldn't give a rip about meaningful education. So, in short, I, I could say a lot more about this like poll, but I think that on the way to establishing full inclusion, where we're not segregate, where students in inclusive post-secondary education are not segregated by virtue of their ability to get credits or not get credits, their ability to be credentialed or not be credentialed. We have to be very careful not to lose sight of those experiences which are educative and those experiences which are more about credentialing. Yep. In fact, interestingly, in general, just one more thing, interesting in general, one of the things that I always say to my students, like all my students, is the best class you will ever take is an audit because you're free to explore your educational experience without worrying about the hoops that you have to jump through, um, getting a credit and a grade. So just some thoughts.
Hmm. Thanks, Bing. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about, so it's MVC anyways. Students were first included in 2003. So it's over 20 years later. And what have we learned about using the audit category to access a meaningful post-secondary education? So um, one thing that we've definitely, like one of the drawbacks to the audit category is that it often presents barriers to students accessing um, areas of campus that are often gatekept through policy that require a certain number of credits or credit hours to access, for example, work studies. Um, there's also access to systems outside of campus that support students. For example, student aid. There's been a lot of barriers in accessing grants for students with disabilities because of the non-credit status. We have found that in most cases, we've been able to navigate those barriers individually for students, and in some cases have shifted practice or policy at post-secondary so that any student enrolled through inclusive post-secondary no longer has to face a barrier to being eligible for a work study funded position or other aspects of the student experience. Um, what we've seen be really positive about the audit category, again, is the degree to which students are learning in their courses. So we've seen students learn more than they thought was possible because they're able to engage in their courses through modifications that are really tailored to them individually. It's also shifted the perception of peers in the classroom to see students engaging in assignments that really highlight what they're learning from the course and what they're passionate about. Um, and so those would be, and it's also provided access to the programs of study, like the vast programs of study that students have pursued that that reflect their interests and the education that they want to get. So those have been definitely the advantage of using the audit category. But I would say in post-secondary, non-credit work tends to be seen as less than for credit work. And so that's one area where we have to be really thoughtful about how are we valorizing modified work within classes. How are we doing that with instructors and how they're viewing the modified work and contributions of students in classes? And it's something that we work on a lot. I know I worked with one student who was like, well, I don't think I should do this because I'm not getting credit. I don't think I should complete this exam because I'm not getting credit. Or instructors who say, oh, it's okay if you can't make the exam because it's not for credit. And so in those instances, we've learned how important it is to make sure that we're talking about the expectations that instructors have for students in terms of completing their coursework. What we've also seen when we look across the like broad variety of practice around accessing post-secondary education, is that often where we've seen the pursuit of credit being the goal, inclusion has suffered. So when we need to design courses for students to receive credit, often what's happening is that we're sort of calibrating, what we see is that people are calibrating the learning to the assumed abilities of students with intellectual disabilities, and that often pulls them out of the typical programs of study or typical learning opportunities in school. So this was some context and some philosophical thought that we wanted to bring to this topic today. And then we really wanted to invite people to talk amongst yourselves and see if any of this sort of broadens your thinking around how students are um, enrolled through the audit category and not receiving credit. So we're going to go into another breakout room. And what we're hoping people can talk about is a meaningful or non-meaningful experience that you or someone you know has had in education, and talk about whether this experience has had anything to do with credit. So I'm gonna paste this again in the chat. Does everybody see that in the chat? So you can take it away to your breakout rooms, and we're gonna do just looking at time. We'll do a 10-minute breakout room and then we'll come back, and if a few people want to share what their group thought around this question. One moment and you'll be called to your rooms. Or write it in the chat or just unmute yourself.
We'll wait a long time, Arden.
Okay.
Maybe I could just chime in. This is Ignacio. Hi, everyone. I think where we ended our last meeting, we were we just shared that yes, in college and university, at least when we went back when we were in school, there was a lot of emphasis on not just credit but the grade you got specifically, and yes, that could have a meaningful impact maybe on graduate school applications and things like that, but certainly, at least in my career and a lot of the folks who are on our line, like once you graduate and you have a job, like the GPA doesn't matter at all. It's all about your skills and experience and your people stuff that you even learn not in classes but just by dealing with other human beings. And so I think that keeping that in mind could also make us rethink how we approach the conversation about what credit looks like for all students, not just the students that we are focusing on helping in this meeting.
Mhm.
I can share just a little piece, just going off of what you just shared. In my group, I shared that I very much was that student in college. The GPA was my only my only goal at the end of it. I put my blinders on. I didn't want to make any pals. Um, and I was just really grade focused. And I think um, my meaningful experience from that actually comes from Denise here. We went to school together and we've been friends for a really long time. And she kind of adopted me despite my blinders and pulled me in. And honestly, like she's been my best friend for many years now. So um, still stayed very grade focused. We both did. And I think we've learned through our work in inclusive post-secondary that the experience is just so much more than that. And the social pieces and the work pieces and all of those things are so much more important too. So.
Mhm.
I can go for a second, Brittany from Douglas College. We had a few interesting points. One I'll bring up, it was from participant Mary. I don't know where she is on my screen, but at the end, she brought up a good point too, talking about how for a lot of us too, we've been in a position where we are privileged to have the opportunity to get credits and grades for things versus maybe some people might not have that opportunity. So keeping that in mind. But also, Teresa put one of our comments in there too about a student who had an opportunity to vote and do things that weren't connected to the grade. And also, I see a few of my Douglas colleagues here today too. And a big part of our programs too is volunteer or unpaid practicums. And sometimes you hit students too going, or they come to you going, oh, it's unpaid. Like, why should I do this? But once they go out and actually get to experience and apply the great skills that they're learning, seeing like their confidence build, again, some of those friendships that you might make at work, sometimes opportunities to slide into a job through that, like a working interview for our students is amazing rather than that traditional conversation with questions for an hour can be difficult. So I think there's a lot of value and meaning in those volunteer opportunities too for that meaningful education experience. So yeah.
Mhm. And I think, like, just to respond to Mary's question of like students, like, I remember I supported a student who had never written an exam until they got to post-secondary because they were on a modified plan through high school. And so what's been really important in creating meaning and establishing the role of learner in classes is to make sure that students are doing all of those components of the course learning, and that they might not get a letter grade that appears on a transcript. So we know it's important then that we work with instructors to provide feedback to the student as well, because we know that feedback is an important component in learning too. Um, Also, we know that a big piece of what makes post-secondary education meaningful is that it increases your employment opportunities afterwards. So we also have to be conscientious when we're supporting students, like, will there be barriers to them in the career they want to pursue because they don't have a credential? And how do we overcome those barriers by building relationships with employers and helping other people understand the learning that the student happened in class. So I think we have to be really conscious of the barriers that the audit static creates and making sure that we understand meaning like broadly as well in terms of the outcomes that students have from attending post-secondary. Um, we have a second breakout room and question. Do you want to move into that thing, or did you have a thought on
No,
the?
let's move into that.
Yeah, okay. So the next question is, how have you seen a focus on credentialing influence meaningful inclusion? So I'll put this in the chat if folks want to copy and paste and write it down. And then we'll go into the groups again for 10 minutes and then we'll come back and debrief. Welcome back. The rooms are just closing up. So we have about 1 minute left in the session. So I'm thinking we'll go a little bit over time because I'd love to hear what conversations you had in your groups, if there's one or two groups that might like to share.
I'll let other people from my group join in after, but one discussion point we brought forward was that sometimes the focus on credentialing really does work against a student and excludes them in their course selection process. I have a student that I support in the vet tech program here who's going into his year 2 courses. And because he's not eligible for registration with the provincial, like provincial credentialing once he graduates, it's really like the instructors are really pigeonholing what classes he should take next year, as opposed to like what classes will be the most meaningful to him. And on a good note, we found a practicum for him that is committed to mentoring him and not just trying to push him into like he can be the receptionist at the vet clinic. So they're committed to also helping him like speak to his instructors about his course selection next year. And I think that's really lucky we found that mentor, but definitely have seen like the focus on credentialing almost being a way to say like, oh, they shouldn't be taking these courses because they're not going to get credentialed at the end.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good example of how it can pull students away from the meaningful experience.
For our group, it was what I found interesting was just this sense of silence of what is the right direction to take, and how do we have a look at like that really big picture. And I had just asked Bing to just share a little bit of around the K to 12 and then the university, and like just that, where have we made really good progress? Where do we need to, where are those shortcomings? What direction do we need to be going into? And then I won't really speak to everything that Bing had shared, but just that we have made some really good progress in that. But I still felt like there's just so many different areas when we talk about credentialing, and that it's a little almost, there's this little bit of fear even in myself of if we take the step in this direction, this is everything that's going to be impacted. If we take a step in that direction, this is everything that's going to be impacted. And you start to like, and I didn't have the knowledge from way over here and way over there to really be able to have a good conversation, only just the experiences that I experienced. So I really appreciate like the collective of coming in, and being able to really hear how everyone's experiences, or the people that they're working with, their experiences are all coming together, and we can kind of get a better sense of what should we be doing, what can we be doing. But then the reflection around that meaningful versus educational, and at what point does that shift happen where you're no longer in that place of I want to go to school because, right? Or these are the things that I'm taking away. This is how it's impacting me too. I'm exhausted, I'm tired, and now I just want to get this done. Right. So that shift, and then how the meaningfulness even moves. And we're starting in the credential area and the meaningfulness is shifted, or vice versa. Right. So I was like, I don't even know what my takeaways were or are from my master's because I was exhausted, right? Like, when did that meaningful place change for me? And then, just taking into consideration, like, we're not just talking about BC, right? We've got lots of folks from other areas, and then we're talking about provincially, how are those things shifted and changed for everybody? So it was just a place of uncertainty maybe for myself around what would be the right direction to take, and then just really understanding the impacts of all of how each of those areas can really connect to the person, the family, the facilitator, the teachers, the school, and all of those different aspects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we always say in Steps Forward, as soon as we think we're doing it right, we're probably doing it wrong. So it's always important for us to think about how we're doing it and why we're doing it this way. Um, I've been working on a research project with Teresa Swan, looking at how modified coursework could be recognized. And I think coming out of it, what's been clear is I think we need this system to recognize and value learners with intellectual disabilities and remove the barriers that are in place because of the modified coursework that they're doing. Instead of trying to fit students into credential models where they have to demonstrate that they're meeting all of these expectations around pretty rigid credit standards. So I don't know if that's right, but I just think a lot is given up if we start down the path of prioritizing credit over the meaningful experience. So did you have some last words, Bing?
No, I think no, I don't. I think that what everyone has said has been very powerful. I don't have any last words.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Our goal for this session was to help people think about this tension in post-secondary, not to have the answer. And so I hope we can continue to go on and think about it, and that the practice of inclusive post-secondary education continues to evolve so that students are getting more and more out of their education. We've got our next session coming up at noon. Let me just make sure yeah, at 12. So we've got a bit of a shorter break now, but we will try to start on time at noon. And we've got a great panel of folks from Capilano University in North Vancouver who will share the work that they're doing to safeguard inclusion within their institution. Thank you, everybody.